1. The sentence that stays. He didn't leave her. That's what made it so confusing. If he had walked away, if he had slammed a door, packed his things, or said goodbye, she would have known what to do with the pain. But he didn't. He stayed close enough to feel familiar. Close enough to feel chosen, sometimes. Yet distant enough to never fully step in. And that kind of absence is harder to name. Because no one tells you how to grieve something that never officially ended. From the outside, it didn't look like heartbreak. There were no dramatic arguments. No final conversation. No clear moment where love collapsed. There was just waiting. Waiting for clarity. Waiting for a decision. Waiting for a future that was always hinted at, but never held. He answered her messages. He showed up when it was convenient. He listened just enough. But when it mattered, when choosing meant responsibility, when choosing meant standing beside her instead of hovering near, he hesitated. And hesitation, repeated long enough, becomes a kind of rejection. This is the story we don't talk about enough. Not the story of being left, but the story of being kept. Kept in uncertainty. Kept in, almost. Kept in the space between hope and truth. Because when someone doesn't choose you, they're not always cruel. Sometimes they're just comfortable. Comfortable letting you wait. Comfortable receiving love without deciding what to do with it. Comfortable enough to stay, without committing. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to shape your life around the possibility of them. You soften your expectations. You postpone your needs. You tell yourself that patience is maturity. Until one day, a sentence settles into your chest. He didn't leave me. He just never chose me. And that sentence doesn't shout. It doesn't accuse. It simply stays. It stays when you replay conversations. When you remember moments that felt real. And wonder why they weren't enough. It stays when you realize that waiting has cost you more than leaving ever would have. Before we continue, if stories like this speak to something unspoken inside you, I invite you to subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Here, we tell the quiet stories. The ones about emotional absence. About love that never fully arrives. About the moments that change us without making a sound. In the next part, we'll begin to understand who she was. Not as someone who waited, but as someone who loved deeply and quietly. 2. Who Nora is. Nora is not fragile. She has never been. She is the kind of woman people mistake for being strong because she doesn't complain. Because she adapts. Because she stays calm when things feel uncertain. But her strength doesn't come from endurance alone. It comes from intention. Nora loves with awareness. She listens closely. She notices small changes in tone, pauses in conversation, the way someone's eyes drift when they're avoiding the truth. She doesn't demand reassurance. She reads the room and adjusts herself instead. Not because she lacks worth, but because she believes love should feel safe, not forced. She grew up learning that consistency mattered more than promises, that showing up quietly meant more than speaking loudly. So she became someone who stays present, even when answers are delayed. Nora doesn't chase. She doesn't test. She doesn't create drama to provoke clarity. She waits. Not passively, but hopefully. With the belief that real connection takes time. That if she gives enough space, someone will eventually step into it. She gives people room to become ready. Room to choose her without pressure. Room to grow into commitment at their own pace. What most people never see is how much discipline that takes. It takes discipline to silence your needs. To soften your expectations. To convince yourself that patience is wisdom. And for a long time, It feels noble. Nora is dependable. She is emotionally available. She remembers details others forget. She holds space without asking for it in return. But beneath that calm exterior is someone constantly negotiating with herself, telling herself not to ask too much, not to move too fast, not to scare someone away by wanting more. She becomes fluent in restraint. And slowly, without noticing, she starts shrinking her desires to fit inside someone else's hesitation. She doesn't see this as self-erasure. She sees it as love. Because Nora believes that if someone truly cares, they won't need to be rushed. They'll arrive on their own. What she doesn't realize, at least not yet, is that there's a difference between patience and being placed on hold, between being understanding and being unseen. And while she waits with grace, life continues moving quietly around her. Moments pass, opportunities fade, and the version of herself that once felt certain begins to feel deferred. Still, she remains kind. Still, she shows up. Still, she believes that love, when it's real, will eventually choose her back. 3. The way she loves. The way Nora loves is quiet. Not because she has nothing to say, but because she believes real love doesn't need to announce itself. She doesn't raise her voice to be heard. She lowers it, trusting that the right person will lean in. Nora loves through consistency. Through being there when it's ordinary. Through showing up when no one is watching. She remembers how someone takes their coffee. She notices the shift in mood before it turns into words. She offers presence instead of pressure. Her love is not urgent. It doesn't demand answers. It doesn't set deadlines. She believes love grows best in freedom. That if you don't corner it, it won't run. So she gives space. More than she should. More than most people would. She tells herself that patience is a form of respect. That allowing someone to move at their own pace is kindness. That love chosen freely is stronger than love insisted upon. When she feels uncertainty, she doesn't confront it immediately. She absorbs it. She asks herself if she's being too sensitive, too needy, too quick to want clarity. And if the answer might make someone uncomfortable, she chooses silence instead. Nora loves by adapting, by adjusting, by becoming smaller in moments when she feels the weight of someone else's hesitation. She doesn't call this sacrifice. She calls it understanding. She believes that love should feel safe. Not demanding. Not overwhelming. Not like something that needs to be defended. So she softens her expectations. She lowers the volume on her needs. She waits for love to meet her halfway, even when it keeps stopping just short. There are moments when she senses the imbalance. When she realizes she is offering more presence than she's receiving. More emotional availability than is being returned. But she tells herself that real love isn't transactional. That keeping score ruins intimacy. And slowly, the imbalance becomes familiar. She learns to read between lines. To accept partial answers. To interpret hesitation as thoughtfulness. She convinces herself that being easy to love means not asking for too much. That if she stays gentle enough, flexible enough, understanding enough, she won't be left. What she doesn't see is how much of herself she's setting aside to preserve a connection that hasn't fully chosen her. Her love becomes a constant offering. Open hands, open heart, no conditions attached. And in that openness, she feels proud. Proud of her capacity to love deeply. Proud of her restraint. Proud of her belief that love, when real, doesn't need to be chased. Still, beneath that pride, there is a quiet exhaustion. Because loving this way requires endless self-control, endless patience, endless understanding. And while she gives love room to breathe, she never asks whether she's allowed to breathe too. 4. Who Ethan is. Ethan is not heartless. That's what makes him difficult to understand. He doesn't wake up intending to hurt anyone. He doesn't manipulate, threaten, or disappear without explanation. In fact, he often believes he's being considerate. Ethan is gentle by nature. He listens. He shows concern in moments that feel safe. He offers warmth, right up until warmth requires a decision. What Ethan fears is not love. It's the weight that comes with choosing. Choosing means consequence. It means standing still when things get uncomfortable. It means disappointing someone else, or himself. So Ethan learns to hover. He stays close enough to feel involved, but far enough to escape responsibility. When emotions deepen, he slows things down. When questions surface, he reframes them as pressure. Not because the questions are unfair, but because answering them would force him to confront what he doesn't know how to give. Ethan has spent most of his life avoiding conflict by avoiding clarity. He believes that if no final words are spoken, no one can accuse him of leaving. He mistakes kindness for neutrality, silence for peace, delay for thoughtfulness. And for a while, it works. People stay. Situations remain unresolved but intact. Nothing breaks, at least not loudly. What Ethan doesn't see is that indecision is still a choice. Each time he postpones a conversation, each time he says, "Not yet," each time he lets someone hope instead of answering honestly, he is shaping the outcome. Ethan tells himself he's protecting the connection, that he's giving things time to unfold naturally, that rushing clarity would ruin something delicate. But beneath that reasoning is a quieter truth. Ethan doesn't trust himself to choose well. He's afraid that once he commits, he'll discover he chose wrong. So he waits for certainty to arrive first, for feelings to settle, for doubt to disappear. What he doesn't realize is that certainty doesn't come before commitment. It's built through it. Ethan is comfortable receiving love without fully stepping into it. He accepts patience as permission, understanding as agreement, silence as consent. And because no one confronts him directly, he assumes everything is fine. He doesn't notice the emotional cost accumulating quietly on the other side. He doesn't see how waiting reshapes someone else's life. To Ethan, nothing has ended. But to the person beside him, everything is suspended. He is not cruel, but he is avoidant. And avoidance, stretched over time, can wound just as deeply as abandonment. 5. A relationship without a name. What they have doesn't fit into a category. It doesn't come with a title, or a timeline, or a clear direction. It exists in the in-between. They are not strangers. They know each other's habits, moods, and silences. They share moments that feel intimate, late conversations, familiar laughter, a sense of comfort that looks like belonging. But they are not fully together either. There is no language for what they are. No word that gives Nora permission to ask, or Ethan obligation to answer. So everything stays implied. They spend time together, but never plan too far ahead. They talk about everything, except what this is becoming. When people ask, Nora hesitates. She chooses careful words. Something vague enough to avoid questions. Something soft enough to protect what little certainty she has. Ethan follows her lead. He doesn't correct the ambiguity. He lets it remain open, undefined. Because undefined feels safe. A name would require intention. A name would turn moments into meaning. A name would ask both of them to decide whether this is going somewhere or nowhere at all. So they continue as they are. Close enough to feel chosen on good days. Distant enough to doubt everything on quiet ones. Nora tells herself that labels don't matter. That connection is what counts. That forcing definition would cheapen something delicate. She learns to live without asking what she's allowed to expect. Ethan, on the other hand, finds comfort in the absence of boundaries. He can give affection without commitment, presence without promise, care without consequence. Nothing is broken. Nothing is resolved. And because nothing is officially wrong, nothing ever gets fixed. Time passes quietly this way. Days stack on top of days. Memories accumulate without a future to hold them. They share experiences that feel too real to be temporary, yet too uncertain to be permanent. And that tension, that constant almost, begins to shape Nora's inner world. She measures her words. She times her questions. She learns when to pull back before reaching too far. The relationship doesn't move forward. But it doesn't end either. It simply stays suspended, floating between intimacy and distance. What Nora doesn't yet name is the cost of living in that space. Because when something has no definition, it also has no protection, no boundaries to lean on, no promises to return to, no clarity to stand on when doubt appears. And slowly, quietly, a relationship without a name starts asking her to give everything, while promising nothing in return. 6. When time becomes an excuse. At some point, time stops feeling neutral. It begins to take sides. What once felt like patience slowly turns into postponement. And postponement, when repeated, becomes a pattern. Ethan never says no. That's the part that makes it confusing. Instead, he says, "Not right now. Let's see. Things are complicated. I just need a little more time." Time becomes the soft answer that avoids a hard truth. Nora learns to translate these phrases. She hears possibility where there is delay. She hears care where there is uncertainty. She convinces herself that timing, not willingness, is the problem. So she waits. She waits through seasons changing, through milestones passing quietly, through moments when clarity feels close, then slips away again. She tells herself that real things take time, that rushing love ruins it, that if she just holds steady, everything will eventually align. And for a while, that belief feels reasonable. Because Ethan doesn't disappear. He stays present enough to keep hope alive. He offers warmth in fragments. Just enough reassurance to reset the clock. Every time Nora feels doubt rise, time is offered as the solution. Not yet. Soon. Later. Time stretches. It stretches conversations that should have happened months ago. It stretches questions that never get answered directly. It stretches Nora's ability to remain calm inside uncertainty. She begins measuring her life in pauses. Pauses before asking for clarity. Pauses before expressing need. Pauses before admitting to herself that waiting has become her role. What she doesn't notice at first is how time quietly shifts responsibility away from Ethan. As long as the issue is timing, no one has to make a decision. No one has to choose. Time becomes a shield. A way to stay close without committing. A way to receive love without defining it. A way to avoid endings by never beginning. And Nora, believing in growth and process, mistakes delay for depth. She assumes that if something hasn't happened yet, it's because it needs more time to mature. But time, on its own, doesn't create movement. It only reveals direction. And the longer she waits, the clearer it becomes. That time is not moving them forward. It is holding them in place. What was once patience starts to feel like being put on hold. Not rejected. Not released. Just paused. And that pause begins to echo through her life. She delays decisions of her own. She hesitates to imagine a future without him. She keeps space open, just in case. Time stops being something they share, and becomes something she sacrifices. And without realizing it, she hands over her present to protect a future that may never arrive. 7. The moment she isn't chosen. It doesn't happen in a dramatic way. There is no raised voice. No argument that changes everything. It happens quietly. A moment arrives when Nora needs him, not desperately, not emotionally collapsed, just clearly. She needs him to stand beside her. To speak up. To be unmistakable. And he doesn't. He doesn't say no. He doesn't say yes either. He stays still, as if neutrality might soften the moment. But neutrality, in moments like this, feels heavy. Nora feels it before she understands it. A subtle drop in her chest. A realization that settles without asking permission. This is it. Not the end of the relationship, but the end of doubt. She notices how easily he steps back. How quickly he chooses comfort over clarity. How his silence protects him, but leaves her exposed. For the first time, she doesn't search for explanations. She doesn't reframe his hesitation as stress or timing or fear. She simply sees it. She sees that when choosing her requires effort, he disappears behind uncertainty. And that's when it becomes clear, this isn't about circumstances. It's about priority. She understands that if he wanted to be here, fully, he would be. No more waiting for the right moment. No more trusting time to do the choosing. No more believing that love will eventually speak for him. Because this moment is speaking. His silence answers every question she's been holding back. Nora doesn't cry right away. She doesn't feel anger. What she feels is something quieter and heavier. Recognition. She recognizes the pattern she's been living inside. The pattern of adjusting herself so he never has to adjust at all. She sees how often she has stepped forward alone. How many moments she carried by herself, while calling it patience. And for the first time, she lets the truth land without softening it. He is not choosing her. Not actively. Not deliberately. But consistently. And consistency, even in absence, tells the truth. This moment doesn't break her heart all at once. It breaks the illusion. The illusion that waiting will change him. That understanding will inspire courage. That love, if quiet enough, will be rewarded. She realizes that love should not require erasing yourself to make room for someone else's hesitation. Standing there, she feels something shift inside her. Not pain, but clarity. A clarity that doesn't demand answers. That doesn't need confrontation. That doesn't ask him to explain. Because explanation won't change what she already knows. This is the moment she isn't chosen. And somehow, in that realization, something begins to choose her back. 8. Presence without protection. He is still there. That's what makes it so disorienting. He answers messages. He sits beside her. He listens when she speaks. From the outside, it looks like presence. But presence without protection feels different. It feels exposed. Nora begins to notice the subtle ways he stays neutral when it matters most. When a line needs to be drawn, he stays quiet. When support requires choosing a side, he steps back. He doesn't defend her. He doesn't challenge discomfort on her behalf. He lets situations unfold in ways that leave her standing alone, while he remains close enough to say he was there. This is not absence. It's something harder to name. Because she can't say he abandoned her. She can only say that when she needed to feel safe, she didn't. Protection, she realizes, is not control. It's alignment. It's the quiet certainty that someone will stand with you when standing costs something. And that certainty is missing. Nora finds herself scanning moments for reassurance. Listening for words that never arrive. Watching actions that stop just short of commitment. He offers comfort after the fact. Gentle explanations. Soft apologies that acknowledge feelings. Without changing behavior. And slowly, she understands the pattern. He wants closeness without conflict. Connection without consequence. Presence without the weight of responsibility. She starts to feel the difference between being accompanied and being backed. When she speaks up, he listens but doesn't act. When she is uncomfortable, he sympathizes but doesn't intervene. When she is questioned, he stays silent and lets her answer alone. She begins to realize that his presence is conditional. It lasts as long as it doesn't require him to risk anything. And that realization reshapes how she sees everything that came before. Moments she once interpreted as patience now feel like avoidance. Silences she excused as calm now sound like withdrawal. She understands that emotional safety isn't about proximity. It's about protection. About knowing someone will not only sit beside you, but stand for you. And without that, being close can feel lonelier than being alone. Nora doesn't confront him immediately. She observes. She notices how often she carries herself carefully so she doesn't create situations that might require him to choose. She sees how she's learned to self-protect because he won't. And that's when something quietly shifts. She stops mistaking presence for partnership. She stops confusing availability with loyalty. She stops believing that being there is enough. Because love, she realizes, is not proven by proximity. It's proven by protection. And in the space where protection should be, she finally understands what has been missing all along. 9. The quiet break. The break doesn't arrive with tears. It arrives with stillness. Nora doesn't collapse. She doesn't raise her voice. She doesn't demand explanations. Instead, something inside her goes quiet. It's not numbness. It's awareness. A moment where the constant effort stops. Where the need to interpret, to adjust, to wait, simply dissolves. She notices how tired she is. Not from loving, but from carrying uncertainty for so long. The questions that once circled her mind no longer ask to be answered. They lose their urgency, their power. She stops rehearsing conversations. That will never happen. Stops imagining responses. That will never come. There is relief in this silence. And grief too. Because the quiet break is not the absence of feeling, it's the end of negotiation. Nora realizes she has been negotiating with herself for years, convincing herself to need less, to want later, to be patient one more time. And now, she doesn't. She doesn't announce the change. She simply moves differently. Her messages become shorter. Her pauses become longer. She stops filling the space when it goes empty. This is not punishment. It's preservation. She begins to feel the difference between missing someone and missing who she was when she was waiting. The ache shifts. She notices how much energy returns when she's no longer scanning for signs. How breathing becomes easier when nothing is expected. The quiet break teaches her something she couldn't have learned while hoping. That love should not feel like endurance. That connection should not require self-erasure. That clarity, even when painful, is lighter than constant uncertainty. She doesn't need closure from him. She doesn't need answers, because the quiet break has already answered everything. She understands that the absence she feared was already there, just disguised as presence. And now that she has stopped trying to bridge the gap alone, she can finally see it. The quiet break is not dramatic. It won't be noticed by anyone else. But it is definitive. It is the moment she stops shrinking, stops explaining, stops hoping for protection that never came. She feels sadness, yes, but it is clean. Not tangled with confusion. Not diluted by maybe. And in that clarity, she begins to feel something unexpected. Strength. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that proves anything. But the steady kind that comes from knowing where you stand. The quiet break does not close the door. It simply stops holding it open. 10. Leaving without noise. Nora doesn't leave the way people expect. She doesn't make a scene. She doesn't deliver an ultimatum. She doesn't demand a final conversation that turns into an argument. Because she has learned something important. Someone who never chose you will not suddenly choose you because you beg for clarity. So she leaves quietly. Not in one dramatic step, but in a series of small disappearances. She stops reaching first. Stops checking her phone the moment it lights up. Stops rearranging her life to keep space open for him. She starts returning to herself. Her time becomes hers again. Her weekends stop being available. Her evenings stop being just in case. She doesn't announce the change, because she doesn't need permission to reclaim her life. At first, Ethan doesn't notice. Not because he doesn't care, but because her presence has been dependable for so long that he assumes it will always return. That's the strange thing about quiet loyalty. People begin to treat it as guaranteed. So when Nora pulls back, it doesn't look like leaving. It looks like she's just busy. Just tired. Just going through something. And she lets it. She doesn't correct his assumptions. She doesn't explain the shift. Because explanation would invite negotiation. And she is done negotiating. Instead, she chooses consistency for herself. She begins to place boundaries. Without calling them boundaries. She answers slower. She declines invitations more often. She stops offering emotional comfort when he shows up only to receive it. And the more she practices this quiet distance, the clearer she feels. Because leaving without noise is not about punishment. It's about refusing to keep participating in your own uncertainty. Nora realizes she doesn't owe him a dramatic exit. Just to prove how much she hurt. She doesn't need to make him understand. She only needs to make herself safe. And safety, for her, means this. No more waiting for words that won't be spoken. No more hoping for protection that won't come. No more lowering herself to fit inside someone else's hesitation. She grieves in private. She mourns the future she imagined. The version of him she hoped would arrive. The version of herself that believed patience could turn into commitment. But she does not turn her grief into a performance. Because she is finally choosing herself. There's a kind of dignity in leaving quietly. A strength that doesn't need witnesses. A courage that isn't fueled by anger, but by clarity. And one day, without ceremony, the leaving becomes real. Not because she blocks him. Not because she disappears to punish him. But because she simply doesn't return to the place where she was never fully chosen. 11. What he learns too late. At first, Ethan doesn't feel panic. He feels silence. A silence that doesn't demand anything. A silence that doesn't ask for clarification or reassurance. A silence that simply exists. Where Nora used to be. He notices it in small ways. Her replies take longer. Her messages are shorter. The warmth he once relied on is no longer automatic. At first, he tells himself she's busy, tired, going through something, because that explanation lets him stay comfortable. It lets him avoid the one possibility he doesn't want to face, that she's done waiting. Ethan has always believed that as long as he stayed close, nothing could truly be lost. He thought proximity was enough. A shared history. A familiar rhythm. He assumed that because she didn't leave loudly, she wasn't leaving at all. But then, the pattern changes. He reaches out and she doesn't reach back the same way. He suggests plans and she keeps them vague. He shows up with his usual softness and finds a quiet boundary instead. That's when he begins to feel it. The cost of what he never chose. Ethan doesn't realize how much Nora carried. Until she stops carrying it. He doesn't realize how much stability she provided. Until her stability is no longer offered to him. He starts replaying moments. Not the happy ones. The ones he avoided. The conversations he postponed. The questions he answered with, later. The times she needed him to stand beside her. And he stayed neutral. He sees, with a clarity he didn't have before, that his silence didn't keep peace. It kept him comfortable. And that comfort had a price. Because a person can only offer patience. For as long as they still believe it will lead somewhere. Once that belief dies, patience becomes self-betrayal. And Nora stopped betraying herself. Ethan begins to understand something painful. He didn't lose her in a moment. He lost her in increments. He lost her every time he asked her to wait without giving her a reason to believe. He lost her every time he accepted her loyalty. As if it were guaranteed. He lost her every time he took her presence but avoided the responsibility that presence deserved. And now, the absence is real. Not as punishment. Not as revenge. Just as consequence. Ethan wants to explain himself. To say he didn't mean to hurt her. To say he was scared. To say he needed time. But he realizes how thin those words sound when time is the very thing he used to avoid choosing. He understands, finally, that kindness without commitment can still be selfish. That being nice is not the same as being present. That staying close is not the same as standing with someone. And the hardest lesson of all settles in. By refusing to choose, he chose to lose. 12. The final truth. Here's the truth most people don't understand until it happens to them. Not every heartbreak looks like someone leaving. Sometimes, heartbreak looks like someone staying. Staying close, staying familiar, staying present enough to keep hope alive, but never stepping fully into you. No slammed doors. No dramatic goodbye. Just a long, quiet season of almost. And almost is a dangerous place to live. Because it teaches you to doubt your instincts. It teaches you to soften your needs so you don't seem too much. It teaches you to accept scraps of certainty and call them love. When someone doesn't choose you, it doesn't always feel like rejection. Sometimes it feels like waiting for your turn. You tell yourself they're busy. They're healing. They're figuring it out. You tell yourself that if you're patient enough, gentle enough, understanding enough, they'll finally see you the way you see them. But the final truth is this. People don't accidentally build a life with you. They don't accidentally protect you. They don't accidentally commit. Choosing is intentional. And when someone keeps you in uncertainty, they may not be cruel, but they are deciding that your peace is negotiable. That your time can be spent. That your heart can be held in suspension. Nora didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she stopped abandoning herself. She stopped calling silence patience. Stopped calling hesitation, care. Stopped calling emotional distance, space. She learned that love without protection is not safety, it's exposure. And she learned that you can't heal in a place where you have to keep shrinking to stay. The bravest thing she did wasn't walking away loudly. It was walking away clearly. Not to punish him. Not to prove a point. But to choose herself in a way no one else could. Because here's what no one tells you. Being chosen isn't about being perfect. It's about being valued enough that someone stands with you, even when it's inconvenient. And if they can't do that, you are not hard to love. You are simply in the wrong hands. If you've ever been kept in, almost, I hope you remember this. You don't need more time. You need more truth. You don't need to wait for someone to decide. You need to decide what your life is worth. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can do is stop waiting for love to arrive and start walking toward the life that finally chooses you back. If this story touched something real in you, please like the video so more people who need it can find it. And I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been in that quiet kind of heartbreak, the one with no clear ending? Tell me in the comments. If you know someone who's stuck in, almost, share this with them. Sometimes, a story is the permission they've been waiting for. And don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast for more deep, cinematic stories about love, loss, and the truths we carry in silence.